after 6 years of trying not to go to Vietnam. They didn't send you to Vietnam if you were in college or if you impregnated somebody. And meanwhile, then, after 6 years of doing that and finally scraping together and getting a sort of quasi-degree, I was actually branded 4F, I think it's called, because I bled. I've never bled before or since. My nose bled the entire time I was going through the selective service draft. Can you believe it? I was standing there in my underwear just bleeding! And they made me, they said, he's a free bleeder. I've never had that happen again before. The stigmata. It was biblical. So I got on a train, I'm going to New York. I'm free, I'm out of college, I'm not going to Vietnam. Woo! Yes, and so what happened is I got a job immediately at Bloomingdale's selling shirts in New York. I checked in and I got my, I'm living in the YMCA at the, it was called the Grand Central YMCA, and then I ultimately lived in the infamous Sloan House. And every night I went and danced at the Stonewall. The Stonewall, the funny thing about then, and I'm going to make this a little bit more detailed than I did before, but the funny thing about life then is that every place played the same music. It wasn't like we had silos then. So you'd go into even like the Stonewall or a gay bar and they'd be playing Wichita Lineman by Glenn Campbell, and then you Marry Me Bill by the Fifth Dimension, and then over there there'd be Steppenwolf going Born to Be Wild, and then you'd have Stevie Wonder going For Once in My Life, but the big one that Born on the Bayou, of course, you know, but Clearwater, but the one that always got me and turned me into the snake coming out of the basket was Marvin Gaye's Heard It on the Grapevine. Bum, 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 bum. The problem with New York was that New York was so run down and corrupt at that point that everything, certainly any gay bar, was run by the mafia and everybody was on the take. So it was very common. It's very funny because, like, for instance, Woodstock was actually a traveling tour and it happened to be filmed there. It wasn't a standalone incident. And the same is true of the riots at Stonewall. They were always chopping up the jukebox. I'd be in the Stonewall, but it was primarily at the sewer. I really loved the place off of Union Square, if you know New York. It was just south of 14th Street. And it was the sewer, and that was where you'd go downstairs. But what would happen is that right in the middle of Heard It on the Grapevine, here would come, in full regalia, smelling of smoke like a slab of ribs in a hammock, here would come the New York firemen with their axes, and they'd chop up the jukebox. And then you would have these drag queens that were, you know, checking your coats, throwing your coats out like a, you know, at a rave in the mosh pits, you know. Here would come your coat and everything. And everybody'd leave, and the mafia would have all these limousines lined up to take us to the next place. And this was New York. It was just so run down and corrupt. I loved it. So, anytime I'd go to, the Stonewall was alright, but I loved the sewer. And every time I'd be at the sewer, here'd come Warhol and his gang, and everybody thinks that's very impressive now, but the truth is, you know, it wasn't history then, and here comes Warhol and his gang. First of all, none of them were attractive. Joe D'Alessandro was, but I only saw him once. Baby Jane Holzer looked good maybe once, but once she got strung out on, you know, cocaine and heroin, you know, picky. They were loud, they were in a bubble, they only interacted with each other, they had no interest in anyone else, they were just very, very vulgar and very loud and very self-important, and everybody hated them. One night, New Year's Eve, going back, when I left for New York, Mother gave me 4 pills and she said, take these, they'll take the edge off when you go for a job interview. Well, I knew that Mother had never met she'd never met a legal drug that she didn't find charming. And so I really took I just really took at arm's length the idea that I'm actually going to take one of these pills, you know, in the daytime, and But it's New Year's Eve, and my friend John Ibsen and I say, listen, let's take one of these and we'll go. So we got on we took the pill, and we neither one of us were really drinkers. Who could afford to drink, for God's sakes? I keep asking people that now. Nobody gives me a good answer. And so we're now getting off of the subway right there at Union Square. And as we get off, it's there, and you've got the clock tower, and it just says, like 20 after 11. We're timing it perfectly. And all of a sudden, as we're walking across in the light snow, couldn't be more idyllic, this pill is kicking in, and he and I are going, and then all of a sudden, bam, our knees went out from under us, and both of us now were absolutely immobilized from the waist down. In which case we start crawling through the snow, and thank God then, because it was corrupt, they didn't have like locked vestibules of the buildings. So we crawl in, and we're covered in melting snow, and we're huddled over in the corner, and we can see it when it turns midnight. So that's how 68 turned to 69 on me. I phoned Mother the next day, and I said, damn it, Mother, what the hell was that? And she said it was Misaline. Well, I immediately went to the library and looked up Misaline, and it was for psychomotor epilepsy. Hangover for 3 days, missed work. My legs just shook for days. Well, the time finally came that it was time to go back to Dallas. It was going to be my 24th birthday in April, and in March at the end of March, I decided to go back to Dallas. There was some guy that worked with me at Bloomingdale's. He was so cute and sweet, and he lived in the Queens, and he brought his car, and he was such, they all had those wonderful accents then, those, bad boy accents, And as I was getting on the plane at LaGuardia to fly back to Dallas, he gave me a joint, marijuana joint. And I wasn't much of a smoker or anything like that, but anyway, I put it in my cigarette thing, because he'd also given me some cigarettes, because with him, I always liked smoking. But I get on the plane, and the plane flies from New York to Washington, and then from Washington to Dallas. Well, in Washington it stops, and who, may God strike me dead, sits next to me on the plane but Senator Wayne Morse of Oregon, who was a very, very big anti-Vietnam leader in the Senate. So he was kind of a hero of mine, really, but I hadn't yet become really that politicized. But I liked Wayne Morse. But he was sitting next to me, and his head was over, and he was having sleep apnea, and he'd go, So I finally thought, you know what? And I took out that joint. They turned the lights out, in the plane. After all, it's the nighttime flight, and you could smoke on a plane. And I took the joint, and I'd go like that, and then I'd go right over the senator's face and go, and he'd inhale it in, and then so finally I realized after I'd done it 3, 4, or 5 times, he was going, ooh, oh. See? So, it was a nice thing to have done. What's with this crowd? So now I get back to Dallas, and my friends all want to do LSD. I've never done LSD, but it was all even on the cover of Life magazine. So they said, let's do LSD, and let's go down. We're going to go down on April the 20th, 1969, my 24th birthday, to the Memorial Auditorium, which is right next to what is now the Dallas, City Hall. And it's going to be this new rock guitarist from Seattle, Jimi Hendrix. So I take the LSD, and we're all dressed up, and I go down there, and all of a sudden now I'm on LSD, and I'm down there and everything. And it turned out that my friend, who was kind of like my non-sexual lover friend, we've all had one of those, but he's a buddy of mine. And he was going with this girl named Barbara, who had had a brief tryst with Jimi Hendrix up in Seattle. So we were able to go backstage. So the very first person that I ever was introduced to, it was just a brief fleeting moment, but still, I mean, the first time I'm ever on LSD, I'm being introduced to Jimi Hendrix. I thought, well, now there is I mean, talk about an inaugural flight. Sadly, what happened then, not in May now, things were looking good. But in May, my father now was starting to become very well known as having been a hugely successful bassist in the big band era. So he was starting to be honored now in different jazz festivals. And I felt very proud of that because my father had been a has-been really the whole time I was growing up, and he had never gotten over it. You know, he was making $350 a week during the Depression, for God's sakes, which was a fortune, playing with top bands like Benny Goodman and everything. And then all through the 50s, you know, he just was struggling to make a living. So I went down to San Antonio with him, and as I drove back from San Antonio, we pulled in the driveway. It was on May 31st, 1969. And as we pull in the driveway, there's all these neighbors there. And I look around, and there's just neighbors everywhere. And I said, well, what is it? And they said, everything's gone. Rawlins, everything's gone. And they said, Mr. Gilliland, we saved your instruments. And they said to me, and my pet at the time was a rabbit named Wanda. And we said, well, we had to put Wanda out of her misery. You know, she was on fire. And I said, on fire? And I looked at the house, and the house looked intact, and then I could see smoke around the windows. And I walked like a zombie up, and I went and opened the door. When I opened the door, there was nothing there except just charred, you know, verticals sort of indicating where rooms had been. It was gone. It was the only home I'd ever lived in. I was 24 years old, and it was gone. Now fast forward to something that I love sharing this, actually. It happened to be on June the 28th, which is actually the night of the Stonewall riots, meaning that the riots had taken place the previous night in New York, but after midnight, so it was in that morning. And now it's nighttime on the 28th of June, 1969. And I decided, I've been tipped off that they are about to demolish the house, you know, that they're going to tear it down the next day. So I decided that I'm going to take LSD and I'm going to go back and I'm going to spend the night saying goodbye to my childhood home of 24 years. So I do that, and I go back. And when the drug kicked in, I just tried to relive and say everything again. I went and laid in the bathtub, and it was still black and peeling, like after Mother had done it. But it was full, of course, now of charred debris, but I just laid down in it and pretended that I'm in the bathtub. And I picked up the melted phone, and I pretended I was talking to Lynn Forless like I had the whole time I was a teenager. And then I walked through my parents' bedroom, and I went back in what had been my bedroom. And I thought, you know what, it's even prettier tonight, because it was always open, but now I can see straight up. I mean, you know, I can see the stars, and it was a full moon. And I looked through the bathroom. There was still the frame of the bathroom when I looked through, and I could see Neville again, and I laughed. And then I lay down where my bed had been in the charred debris. And for a moment, I just lay there, and I could once again, as I watched the wind blowing the trees and feeling the breeze, I just one last time could remember what it was to have dreamed. When it was almost dawn, I walked out. I stood in the backyard and I looked at the house, the way you would say goodbye when you're leaving a funeral. And I said, you know, Rawlins, you now have no home and you really have no past. It's the only place you've ever lived, really. And here's what you've learned. When we suffer absolute loss, close friends are very close for 2 weeks. And then after 2 weeks, they begin to drift. And after a month, they think we've begun to move on. But I said to me, but Rawlins, you know that this loss, this tragedy is palpable. And the mourning indefinite. So, here's my poem to you. That rather than continue seeking solace from the empathy of others, adopt instead this approach to life's lament. That beginning now, tonight, you acknowledge what has long been true, that your constant companion, your loyal ally, the most trusted, comforting confidant, shall be forever you.